Hello and welcome everyone for another show of Med Talks. We're broadcasting live on radio, on Pendle Community Radio, Awaz 103.1 FM. And also, of course, we're broadcasting it online on YouTube as well as Facebook. So please do check out Med Talks. That's Med Talks with an X. And you will certainly see evidence that, we look better than we sound. So just a couple of numbers for you guys to be aware of. So if you have any questions, obviously you can interact with us through our social media platforms, and we will try to get those questions in. But two numbers for you to be aware of, 01282 723 455. And then we also have our WhatsApp number, which is 07522 723 455. Over to you, Fahim.
Thank you so much, Mehran, and a warm welcome to everyone listening and watching and spending their evening with us. Introductions first, if we go ladies first. Gitika Buttoo is a British Indian theatre director from Yorkshire. She graduated from Liverpool in 2016 with a BA Honours in Drama and English. She assisted James Writing on Ode to Leeds at Leeds Playhouse as part of a JMK Trust bursary in 2017, and then went to work for the Octagon Theatre in Bolton, not far from Mehran and myself here, as their participations director, where she was also the assistant director on Main House Productions and directed all their youth theatre productions. And also this evening we have Professor Ian Almond. We need to be on our best behaviour, I think, to have Prof in the house. Professor Ian Almond is Professor of World Literature at Georgetown University in Qatar. He has taught in Turkey, Italy, India, Germany, obviously Qatar, the UK, and the United States. He received his PhD in English Literature from Edinburgh University 2 decades ago now, back in 2000. He's the author of 6 books. Hopefully we'll talk about his most recent one later on in the show. And his most recent book, the one I alluded to, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2015. It's a delight to have you both.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Can we start with you, Ian, if we may, this evening? So South Asian Heritage Month, that's what we're commemorating, and that's what tonight's about. Can you give us a bit of a background as to what your experience has been in terms of the South Asian community, starting with the UK?
I mean, I feel a bit self-conscious being here because for people who are listening, I'm the only sort of Gora here, and it's South Asian. So I feel a little bit sort of, thanks for inviting one of the formerly violent imperialist colonizers onto the show. I guess, I suppose the most obvious thing to say is that I grew up, I'm actually like Gitika. I'm from Yorkshire originally. Like Gitika, I have dual passport, Lancashire and Yorkshire. I came to Lancashire when I was 7, but I grew up in Preston. And half of our gang, it was a huge gang of about 15 kids on what is today called Broadgate. And half of them were Hindu. Basically, I grew up with British second generation Gujaratis. And that is the most immediate thing. I have to say that half of the kids were Hindu, Gohils, Mistries, Patels and that. Half of them were, British Muslim, so Tagaris and Khans and Masters and that. And there was a couple of the white kids and me. And we just hung out and we argued with one another, and we had all kinds of, up until the age of 16, we had all kinds of fights and quarrels and had a great laugh. And I guess the most obvious thing to remember is that identity never really played any kind of role. When we argued, and we had cliques and groups and stuff, but it was always along the lines of personality. But our own sort of white or Muslim or Hindu identity was sort of completely, we were just mucking around. And I guess that's the most personal with regards to where we are today, sort of the community in Preston that's listening. That's the most obvious thing I have to say. And then many years later, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so it's taken you so long to meet Javed's and Shakur's.
Right. Yes. Yes.
So
it's been a journey.
Yeah,
a journey, culminating in this moment, right?
Fantastic. So is that how you got into literature?
I love literature, and for me, and yeah, it wasn't really. I wasn't. It's kind of all that stuff that happened in my childhood was never because when we were kids, the word multicultural would have been anachronistic, right? I mean, it never occurred to us any kind of post-colonial or multicultural, anything like that. And then sort of years later, in a completely independent way, and completely unconsciously, sort of, I drifted into post-colonial. I did English and American Lit, and then, like Gitika, I was really interested in literature and the arts. And I figure if you're going to write about post-colonial literature, you should get off your arse and go and live in India for a year, right? Instead of just being an armchair intellectual. So I spent a year in Bihar learning Hindi, and yeah, and then just got swept off my feet. And I originally started with like English language writers like Rohinton Mistry and Amitav Ghosh and, you know, Arundhati Roy and Jhumpa Lahiri and all but then of course, you know, you start to read the Bhasha literature, right, in translation. And so, you know, reading the stories of the Chotogolpa, the stories of Tagore in particular, but also not his poetry, but his short stories. And the novels of, you know, Nirmal Verma and Prem Chand and obviously Anita Desai's English language, but they just swept me off my feet. And I guess that's my abiding interest here. I'm not so much interested in, obviously I have a respect for Hinduism and I'm interested in Hinduism, but that it's the power and force and depth of modern South Asian fiction, which really sort of is my abiding interest. I think it's a fascinating period, so.
Okay, I think that lends itself nicely to bring in Gitika. Obviously, we've had the literature background. First of all, happy birthday to you, Gitika, and thank you for joining us on your birthday. Can you tell us your journey, obviously, the theatre background, and maybe some of the books or influences that got you into that, and also a little bit about identity. What does your South Asian identity mean to you in your personal life and maybe in terms of your professional life?
Yeah, sure. So, I've always been really interested in story from a really, really young age. I would say less so literature, more so films. I don't know whether that's my millennial sort of generational thing coming into it, but I was brought up around a lot of Bollywood films growing up. So I was just so encaptured by, you know, the detailed storylines, by how dramatic it was, by the singing, the fact that they could do everything. And I just really enjoyed watching Bollywood films with my family. And that love of film continued. And actually, one of the most inspirational women I think that I followed growing up was Gurinder Chadha, who directed Bend It Like Beckham. Not sure if you guys have seen that.
Absolutely, we have.
that film absolutely made my sort of childhood and growing up, because for the first time ever, I saw this British film that wasn't a Bollywood film that all of my mates saw, because it had Keira Knightley in it, and it was our lives on screen, and it just, you know, it filled me with excitement and joy, and made me feel a part of something, and like, you know, that a story like mine matters. So I think she's played a huge part in where I am today, Gurinder Chadha. And then moving on to theatre then, I think the first time that I knew I wanted to work in theatre, because I was thinking about this earlier, was in Bradford when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I went to a theatre there and watched a piece called All in Good Time. And it's written by Ayub Khan then, who's the same guy that wrote East is East. Absolute legend. And he wrote this play about a British Asian family growing up in Bolton, and a newlywed couple had just got married, and they were trying to consummate their marriage in this house that is full of their in-laws. So every time they try and consummate it, someone walks into the bedroom. So it's a comedy, but it's so loaded. Again, it was one of those stories that I fully related to, and that a lot of British South Asians could relate to. And I turned around in this auditorium in Bradford to a sea of brown faces, and for the first time I felt really empowered, and I thought, you know, I'm not a minority here. I feel a part of something. I feel like I belong somewhere. I've gotten really deep already, but I think that's the moment I turned around and thought, if I can create this for other people, I have to do it. I have to make theatre. So that's how I got to where I am. I don't know if I've answered all your questions, but
It was a very loaded question, though, wasn't it? You could have talked about it for about 15 minutes. But I guess why is South Asian heritage important, Gitika?
I think, well, it is important. I guess it's important to me, right? I'm South Asian, and it's something that hasn't always been important in my life. I think I fully rejected it, actually, growing up. I think it's something that I've only been really proud of and wanted to celebrate as I've grown up, because I think when you're younger, I'll speak for myself, I'm not going to generalize. When I was younger, I just wanted to fit in. I just wanted to, you know, get my head down at school, not stick out too much, dress like the white girls, talk like the white girls, just so that people wouldn't question anything. And that kind of carried on happening throughout life. But then it was only really, I would say, university, which is such a long time. You know, it took me to about 18 years old until I really celebrated my heritage and thought, actually, no, the fact that I'm different makes me interesting, and that's not something I should hide.
Beautifully put. How about yourself, Ian? What got you interested in specifically, I guess, Bengali literature? Because I know you're an expert on the Bengal, and that's obviously large.
I wouldn't call myself an expert. I would be fluent in Bengali, in Bangla, if I was an expert. I mean, like we're juggling here, aren't we? Because like we have South Asian heritage in the UK, and then there's the sort of the whole. If you know, in India and in South Asia, the debate is very, very different, right? Because I was just thinking of Mehran's question earlier: why is South Asian heritage important? You know, to be a little bit critical, yeah. I mean, we're going to have a conversation here. Like, part of me obviously thinks it is. It's a given, right? That you know, we you know, and we can come up with this sort of multicultural ideas that people are familiar with, and it's great that we celebrate the diversity. I wonder sometimes whether, and again, I'm just being really honest, okay? I hope you don't mind this hour, but I'm just gonna sort of speak what I think, right? I wonder sometimes whether, given the levels of racism and the levels of racism that British South Asians have experienced in the UK, because obviously we're going to talk about this, and I feel sort of pretty negative about the whole situation, to be honest. I wonder sometimes whether turning and celebrating one's South Asian heritage can be a kind of defense mechanism. Do you know what I mean? I hope I'm expressing that as carefully as possible. I'm not sort of dismissing anyone's work or anything, but there is that danger that sort of, okay, so if others won't hear me, then I'll turn back to the people I came from and speak to them. Do you know what I mean? And that is, I guess, one of my concerns. But no, how do we get? Well, I often sort of like, because I come from like a British working class background. I know my tribe very well, right? And Bradford, I know my cousins live in Bradford, and I know what they're like. And I often wondered, like, you know, the idea of them ever watching a Satyajit Ray film or reading a novel by Anita Desai would be sort of surreal, really. But I'm sure that if we could actually bring them to that point, they would actually enjoy it. But I think that's one of the reasons I liked things like, okay, this is probably old. I don't know if Gitika remembers this, but there was a film called My Beautiful Laundrette. I mean, one of the things that I know, Hanif Qureshi was a controversial figure in his own community, right? I mean, he's hardly the most pious of Muslims, let's put it mildly, right? But I really admired the fact that he had a very honest look at how different groups work with one another and how they screw not just each other over, but also themselves. And I really admired that honesty in Hanif Qureshi. A Turkish parallel to this is the films of Fatih Akin, if you've ever seen them. Like, he doesn't just talk about racism, but he also talks about the ways in which the immigrant community in Germany, the Turkish immigrant community, are biased and prejudiced towards one another. Like, it's, and I really sort of anyway, I don't want to ramble, but that for me, South Asian heritage is great, but yeah, and it's not a mutually exclusive thing, obviously. But I do wonder sometimes, giving and I don't know, I'll ask you three, you know better about this than I do, British Asians living in the UK, but sometimes sort of like I do feel a little bit depressed because I only come to the UK about 3 months in the year. I live in Qatar, right? And it's a bit of a bizarre. I get this kind of both. You know, I have British Asian friends in Preston, but then of course I have white friends and white relatives, and you know, it's almost like visiting sometimes two societies. And I don't know. I'm looking for things which would something like East is East, for example. At least you know that was people. There were white people who watched that and found it funny. But yeah, it would be great if we had sort of like texts and plays and films which broke across that. Do you know what I mean? And created some kind of intercultural thing. And none of the multicultural bullshit, like none of this liberal glib sort of, but honest cinema and honest theatre, you know, sort of telling it how it is. But
just for listeners and viewers, just about the watershed moment. But thank you for your honesty, Ian. But I think you've obviously highlighted some important points. I guess the concept of racism or ignorance. You know, there is a fine line. At the same time, you know, that it really depends on how that person feels. That's kind of how my understanding of how to address and understand racism. If we think about Enoch Powell's speech back in the 60s, who used to be a Conservative MP, this was when there was a mass migration, and he was very worried about what it meant to the social demographic within the UK. And I think he was trying to go, you know, and add some amendments to the Race Relations Act. So I think politics, as well as immigration, these are obviously clearly issues, and I think I would love to have had someone on hindsight living through that experience, but some people still feel that difficulty now, and it's not just exclusive to South Asians. It's you know, lots of people from different communities. I don't know whether this comes out in art, Gitika, or if there's an opportunity to highlight that, because obviously when you have a visual form, it can help people relate. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that, if I'm talking about, so as I was listening, I was thinking about conversations that I'm having in theatre at the moment, because it is totally still prevalent about representation and how we put that on stage and what stories do we choose for theatre. And, you know, East is always your usual go-to to put bums on seats, because we know that English people enjoy that just as much as South Asian people do, because it's loaded with comedy. But actually, is that part of the problem now in 2020? You know, it's not good enough anymore to be showcasing our stories for English people to laugh at. That's, you know,
sure.
And I think that it's less now about making work for the white gaze, which before we totally had to do in order to get jobs and to be listened to. But now I really do think, as a younger generation coming into theatre, I'm going to stop apologising for not pitching East is East, because I don't want to direct it. I don't think that it's relevant right now in 2020. It's a beautiful piece. It makes everybody laugh in the family. But if I'm being given space, I'm really going to think twice about how I'm going to use that space, because maybe it's about a story of someone growing up nowadays who's 16, and we're talking about problems happening now in 2020 and not in the 70s or 80s. But yeah, it's definitely something that's happening in theatre, the conversations a lot.
I mean, going on that theme, Gitika, sorry to interrupt, Ian. Going on that theme, Gitika, obviously you've got strong feelings on why you're not keen on East is East, and I would actually concur with that, because I think you can get quite quickly into a stereotyped view of the South Asian world. Yeah, there's certain things. The East is East, the West is West, the Bhaji on the Beach, Mississippi Masala, you know, you just reel them off your tongue. Oh, goodness gracious me. We all know these things. Apu in The Simpsons, you know, and there's a certain way South Asians have been characterized in the Western hegemony of the media, of controlling of the media. So I'm glad that's why we've got you tonight, because I want to hear the stories you want to make and the stories you want to portray. I guess the question I want to ask, moving on what Ian has got us onto a conversation about, is the stories you want to make. Does that necessarily have to talk about your South Asian identity, or is it simply you are a South Asian doing theatre work and really you don't want your identity necessarily to be the focus of the subject matter? Because I find this a very interesting conundrum. You see that a lot of people in the media who are putting their work out, they're like, I don't want to be called, say if they're Muslims, to talk about, you know, the next terrorist attack or the next Muslim issue. I just want to be talked about, you know, in terms of what's going on in the politics or something like that. What do you feel in terms of your responsibility as to what you need to put out there?
Do you know what? I think it changes depending on what's going on politically. About 3 years ago, all I wanted to do was direct things that I'd studied at university on that syllabus. And they were often written by white playwrights and often men. And that was all I knew back then. And I think at that point, it's totally okay for me to want to tell that story. And getting pushed back by lecturers or by other people on your course who would assume that actually, no, you would do something to do with your identity is totally wrong. Because I know that a lot of people have experienced that, not just at universities or drama schools, but in the industry. You're almost sort of expected as a brown or black artist to talk about, you know, trauma, essentially, a lot of the time, and talk about our heritage stories, which is so important. But I'm trying to highlight the fact that there's a lot of artists out there who don't want to talk about that and just want to direct a piece of Shakespeare, and that should be okay. We need to normalize that. But in my personal, where my practice is right now, I do want to be making stories about identity because it's something that I've been looking at for the last year or two. And it's something that I'm really interested in, looking at sort of being British, what it means to be British, but also what it means to be South Asian, because it's just something that's been on my mind. So call me, I don't know, egotistical for wanting to make work about me and what my thoughts are. But I just know from conversations with a lot of friends and other South Asian people living in this country that it's something that hasn't been talked about a lot. So if I'm getting commissioned to do things, why would I not pitch those stories to talk about?
Can I ask Gitika a question? This is a conversation, right? Do you mind if I ask?
Absolutely. No, go for it. Yeah.
Out of a job, but I was just. I'm curious. Like, so, like, as an artist, right? How do you? Is there a tension there between doing something that you want to do personally, but also aware that obviously, particularly in theatre, there's a body of people. There's literally, it's not even like a poem or a novel. There's literally, 50, 100 bodies out there that are going to physically respond to what you do. Is there a tension there between what you want to do and what you think they want to see? Or
I don't know. I don't think about it, Ian. Because I think. Well, I do. That's a lie. People joke that I'm more of a producer sometimes than I am a director. So just to be clear, there's lots of different roles in theatre, but a director in theatre is someone who takes a play and basically puts the words onto stage and sort of tells the actors where to be and how to do it, essentially. A producer does all sorts of things. They absolutely make the thing happen. So they make sure that the tickets get sold. They make sure that the venue's on point. They get all the contracts sorted for the artist, source the artist, absolutely everything. And I think maybe this is because I am South Asian. I've had to think about being a producer and a director. So I always have to think about audience first. So yes, there is a bit of me that thinks about audiences and there's a bit of pressure on me to tell stories, but actually I'm past the point. This sounds really bad. I'm past the point of caring, because I just want to make sure that people are seeing themselves represented on stage who aren't, I don't know if that answers your question, Ian, but
no.
Just to follow on that, Gitika, and maybe quite a straightforward answer or maybe a complex one, but how would you gauge a success on your production? How would you feel that, what you've done is accomplished?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, for me, it's not about ticket sales. It's not about reviews in The Guardian. For me, I make theatre to tell important stories, right? And I'll give you an example of something that I thought was a success of something that I've done. So I directed a show for Derby Theatre a couple of years back, and it was about forced marriage, specifically within South Asian families. And it's a huge topic in Derby. It's so prevalent. The figures are really high. So we had to make it in Derby, and it was going to go on a schools tour afterwards. And there was 15 different disclosures from lots of different schools of people who had either experienced forced marriage firsthand or knew someone who did and wanted to report it. And for me, that's a success. From a story that some kids have seen in a school hall to 15 disclosures, we've, hopefully some lives have really been changed. And I think that's a really dramatic answer, but that's the first thing that I think of when I think of success, because I was like, yeah, we nailed it, regardless of how many people saw it or who reviewed it in what newspaper.
Yeah.
Ian, can we turn that question to yourself? You're obviously multi-author. How do you measure success in terms of as an academic writing books? I know we've joked off air about you don't expect many to read your books, but I mean,
usually 9 people and a dog read my books. Like, no one just writing to get jobs.
But yeah, I mean, how do you think you've done a successful portrayal of your work of this, literature?
No, I mean. Like it's such a monastic vocation, you're writing books. A bestseller in an academia is 1,000 copies and over. So that gives you a sense of where we're at, right? So, I mean, I've only ever written one general book, if you like, which was a military history of Muslim Christian alliances. Okay, so I just got so pissed off with the BBC constantly talking about Europe and about Christian Europe and this whole fantasy of a Christian Europe. So I just looked at all the moments in the history of Europe where Muslims and Christians actually fought in the same armies against armies that were also made up of Muslims and Christians. And I think that's the only book where really I've had lots of people email me saying, how much they didn't realize that there was that Islam, the history of Islam was always at the center of the history of Europe. Like so that was in terms of success, because, obviously, unlike Gitika, you don't get sort of hundreds of people coming into. You don't get that. You never really feel, as an academic, you never really feel that anyone's even reading your books. So that was like the only time that I really felt sort of like that there was this response. Unfortunately, the overwhelming number of those emails were Muslims. So, the target audience really had been sort of Westerners. And although there were sort of Western reviews and things like that, it was mostly Muslims who emailed me on that book, which I think says a great deal, really. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
But you raised an important point, though, Ian, just about the contribution. I guess we've naturally delved into things that we want to improve. But I guess this is, we also have to appreciate all the contributions that have happened, not just 20th century, but even during the formation of the East India Company in India, as well as opportunities, integration, how things developed. We all have opinions, and perhaps there are things that could be done differently or better, because unfortunately things that divided communities then happened before and continues to happen even to this day. But certainly about the role of their involvement in World War I, World War II, and there's obviously the post-World War migration. Now, when it comes to South Asia, I guess we're talking a lot of perhaps India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, aren't we? But we also have to remember Nepal, Afghanistan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, and all this. So it's just making sure that their voices and their contributions are also heard. And to be honest, I know very little, and this is a good opportunity for me to understand, then kind of take that next step. So it gives you certainly an opportunity to write things down, because when it's written and it's there, no one can destroy it. So that obviously leads to a great sense of responsibility on your part. But it was just interesting.
I think apart from the fact that very often academics write out of a sense of boredom,
Okay.
I think I'm a little bit disenchanted with the whole sort of venture of trying. So, for example, this is South Asia Heritage Week, right? Trying to sort of write at various times and point out the violence of the British Empire. Yeah, the fact that it was an inherently violent structure, that it caused a great deal of damage. There's a conversation there about modernity, and there's a conversation there about complexity. But, and I think the reason I'm disenchanted is that I'm not sure if the provision of empirical knowledge really seems to change people's opinions. People are so committed to a kind of fantasy version of empire that it becomes very. So the startling statistic was that 60% of people in the UK polled thought that the British Empire was a force for good in the world. And we're still. I find that extraordinary. And even though my point, I'll say provocatively, isn't just about British people, I think the standard thing about most people is that they see other people's empires as empires. They often see their own empire as administration or an important moment of cultural influence, right? Nobody ever sees their own empire as violent. But even with that proviso, it is a bit depressing, I've sort of given up trying that sort of avenue of using history as a tool to try and show people, that, we have a multicultural past, and that there was these moments of violence, and that I'm not sure if it works. We're talking about success. I'm not sure if it works. I think it's very difficult to sort of get people to disembed their narratives and certainly become aware of how violent the British were in India, or for that matter, for God's sake, in Kenya. Kenya, that's the 1950s, right? And they're mutilating, torturing people in the 1950s. This is why we were watching Norman Wisdom films, and I find it extraordinary that there's this kind of selective amnesia. And as an academic, no, I don't feel successful in that. I don't think it's worked at all. I think there has to be sort of, and really people like Gitika are in a better position to try and sort of provide and provide some kind of imaginal artistic corrective to those kinds of fantasies that in this case the British have about their empire. Yeah. Am I ranting? Sorry.
No. We'll stop you if you do. Don't worry.
I have a rant button. You can just switch it on and off. Okay.
Gitika, I think Ian brings us on nicely onto the topic of migration, and that's a big one that's synonymous with the South Asian experience. I mean, how does migration, whether in terms of ancestry or other people migrating from one country to the other, or in terms of your representation in the theatre, what you've seen growing up, how has that been a part of your identity and your work?
It's been massive, and actually only something that I knew about. I want to say, how old was I when my granddad was telling me stories about partition? I want to say as late as 15, 16, which is awful. But I don't blame him, because what a traumatic time to go through the partition and to go through something like that. So these conversations at home weren't happening on a regular basis, because who wants to talk about something that they're trying desperately to forget, to move on? And that completely just turned my world upside down, because I'd heard about partition a little bit, not from school, but from having other mates from South Asian, with South Asian heritage. But then actually to hear my granddad's first-hand experience of what it was like shocked me so much that I had to then go and speak to everyone else who was in his generation, go and find out from his other brothers and sisters about what their experience was like, because that's not stuff that I could find easily in textbooks or on Google at the time. And yeah, it fully turn my world upside down. And I was angry actually for a really long time. And I remember in a history lesson once asking, when I think we were studying the Egyptians, asking, when are we going to learn about this part of history that my granddad told me about? And I was very quickly hushed into, we can chat about that after the lesson. And we did chat about it, and hats off to my history teacher. He told me loads about it. But actually, I wanted to have that conversation with the rest of my classmates there, because, I'd often get called the P word on the way home from school, and I'd want them to know about everything, so that actually maybe they might not call me the P word on the bus. And I think, when it comes to stories, I think it has a really important role to play, because I just want other people to see, I think this is the point that Ian was mentioning, that actually for young people nowadays, I feel like history books and knowing about history is important, but it's not something that they can easily access or would want to access, because it's not quick for them. If it's in a film, if it's on Twitter, if it's on Facebook in a short movie that's a minute long that they can kind of have their attention on and then move quickly on, I think it's easier to digest for them. Does that make sense? And I think that this is the way that we're going to educate people quicker and faster, because we're in this, clicking generation that actually if we don't move fast with the times, we're going to get left behind, and there's going to be another generation who ignore empire and don't know anything about it, and then another generation of racism continues.
But can I just say something there? Do you mind if I just jump in there?
Yeah, sure.
Relying on the mainstream culture, the problem with that is that when you look at I'm thinking of Netflix, I'm thinking of major film productions, on Churchill, The Crown. I mean, it's the whitewashing of empire is extraordinary. And these are these are international productions now. We're not just even talking about domestic consumption here. We're talking about people around the planet who don't know much about history. Watching The Crown. I had Pakistani students in my American university where I was recommending The Crown to me. And I started watching it thinking, oh, well, if two of my Pakistani students are recommending it, it must be great. And I'm sorry, I thought it was awful. The way they treat the Queen's visit to Kenya, with all these, Kenyans adoring her, and, on this reverential mythologizing of the Queen, and that this is the mainstream culture appears to have no critical bite in its treatment of people like Churchill, whose argument really with Hitler was territorial. It wasn't ideological. Churchill was practically a fascist. So I don't know whether, I think one of the problems amongst the many here that we can address, but one of them is political. We see a political pressure, even something as explicit as when William Hague invited Niall Ferguson, a kind of notoriously right-wing Harvard historian, whose basic argument is Britain gave modernity to the world. It's a very familiar argument. And this guy was 10 years ago was brought in to advise on the GCSE syllabus in the UK. So we have a whole history syllabus in the UK. Now, this isn't conspiracy theory. This is actual stuff that is happening. So, I mean, absolutely, there's people like yourself, Gitika, who need to sort of work against this. But it's a bigger problem as well. There's a structural, there's a material problem to that. I don't know, in many ways, I am very materialist in this. I think there are material issues here about capital, about big production, about corporate decisions, which are going with these very, very empire-friendly narratives,
I totally agree with that, Ian. And I think in an ideal world, we'd have a curriculum that shows everything that happened with no sort of shying away from history that puts Britain in a bad light. And we'd have amazing productions and stuff on Netflix that's fully informed and shows lots of different narratives. But I think the problem is that, because I completely agree with you, Ian, you know, I watched The Crown, I enjoyed it, but part of me was like, this isn't a true representation of what was going on. And it's about having diversity in the right places. That's what it comes down to. It's all well and good sticking a few, you know, brown and black faces on a screen, but if the director isn't, you've got a problem. If the writer isn't, you've got a problem. And actually above that, especially in TV and film, if you're casting directors and you're the people who are sat in those rooms in Channel 4 and on Netflix and in BBC, if that room is not diverse, you're going to get problems like we've just talked about. And yeah, I was just going to talk about A Suitable Boy that's on BBC, but I don't know if anybody's seen that, but I think that's, again, a product of what you were just talking about, Ian.
There is actually, I'm just going to interrupt you there, Fame. There is actually a question from one of our viewers on YouTube. Just asking, it's open to either of you. What do the both contributors think of the serialization of A Suitable Boy in BBC? The name certainly sounds familiar. So what are your thoughts about that? Because obviously it's in production. I think there's been a few episodes now.
Yeah, have you seen it, Ian?
Yeah, I've seen the first episode.
I saw the first episode, and I'm not going to watch the rest, I don't think.
My main problem with it was that every time I'm lying. I saw about 25 minutes of it on BBC iPlayer. I like the fact that it was they didn't have it was an all Indian cast, as far as I could see, which is great. I mean, they kind of had to, given if you've read Vikram Seth's book, right? But I think the problem that I immediately picked up with it was that every time there was a conversation between the two characters, any two characters, there was always a kind of Mughal piece of architecture in the background or a Hindu temple, you know, like. I mean, that was for me the most immediate thing. Like I just felt that the international audience was compromising the integrity of the script. But I'm saying that on 25 minutes of it.
No.
So you really didn't like it, Gitika? You really sort of viscerally.
I also lied and only watched about 25 minutes. Mad how we stopped at the same time. It was a fully South Asian cast, but the playwright or the screenwriter was I don't know what his name was, but he was a white guy, and I feel like it showed, you know, because yes, Vikram wrote the novel, but so much gets lost between book and screenwriting. And I just felt like it was completely lost. I was also on Twitter at the same time, looking at the hashtag and following what people were saying. And they just weren't understanding it because, I don't know, and I wasn't understanding it. And this is something that's supposed to be my heritage, that I should get like that. And it certainly wasn't made for me. And I feel like it wasn't made for white. Well, I don't know. I just didn't enjoy it. But I know a lot of my family members who did, and some really hated it. So also the thing for me, and I haven't read the novel, Ian, so correct me if I'm wrong, is it about essentially a love story between a Muslim boy who falls in love with a Hindu girl? Is that what the gist is?
Yes, yeah. I mean, but there's about 6 stories parallel. There's about
right.
Yeah.
Because I feel like those stories have been done to death, especially in Bollywood. I don't know about you guys. So if they're making it for me, I've seen it. I saw it when I was 5.
Love can never be done to death. Don't say that.
I mean, it's an interesting point, Gitika, about it being done to death. That's what I thought. I watched one episode of it, and I wasn't going to watch more. And that's because I found some of the scenes quite explicit, if I'm honest. Even though it's after 9 o'clock, I didn't want to be watching this with my dad and my wife. Actually, I didn't want to be watching it at all, but definitely not. Even though some reviews say it's okay, I didn't think it was. But I thought, absolutely.
That was the only reason I tuned in.
But in terms of that Hindu-Muslim thing, I feel like it has been done to death, especially with the Indian audience in mind. And I wonder if there's more profound reasons for that, because the India-Muslim marriage and things is quite prominent in Bollywood, as you know, as you follow Bollywood, Gitika. It seems to be, in some ways, this South Asian thing is worth exploring, because it seems much more common to have that association in India, or at least highlighted, than maybe in the UK, where perhaps that sort of, it was more about the Asian and the white English association, like is the East is East, but it wasn't the Hindu-Muslim association. Have you noticed these sort of parallels, and what do you make of that, Gitika?
Yeah, I mean, also, I think the thing is with telling a story like that on a prime slot on BBC, Sunday night, fantastic. Like, I'm really happy that we managed to get, secure a slot like that. But commissioning a story set in that time allows us as British people to disconnect from it, I think. It allows us to go, oh, this was happening ages ago. Me as a 25-year-old, Indian girl from Leeds, I'm not really interested in it. Whereas actually the stories that I might be interested in and that my friends might be interested in is what my dad went through coming here in the 70s or 80s, which is much closer to us than something that was happening ages ago in India. Do you see what I mean? I just feel like that slot could be used for something, a story that is much more relevant. And maybe actually we whiz past the 70s and 80s and talk about what's happening now. I don't know. I have a problem with it, and I still can't fully articulate why. So when I do, I'll send you an email and you can have a full on read.
Do you not think, like, one of the problems here again, and I'm sorry, I'm a leftist, so I keep coming back to the money, all right? I'm sorry, but isn't one of the problems here that the marketing behind the conceptualization of the adaptation necessarily brings these international audiences into play? So a book like A Suitable Boy becomes sort of, it appeals to a kind of age of multicultural capital. It appeals to a multicultural narrative. It brings in the possibility of 2-3 audiences. It has an imaginary landscape that, it's still sort of British Raj-ish, isn't it? It's the 1940s, 50s, but it's still in that period. I think there's a number of templates that would be accessible. And maybe that was the bottom line, that it would be much more accessible to a wider audience. That's my gut feeling.
We do have another question coming in. This is a question from Mebs. You don't have to specifically answer it, Gitika, but you talked about the partition and some referred to some distaste about it. So I think he's asking, who were you angry with about the partition? But from my perspective, is this something that was inevitable? So I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, totally. So maybe I got my words muddled up. I was angry about A Suitable Boy, not partition.
Yeah.
I'm also angry about partition. Shouldn't have happened. Specifically, what am I angry with? Well, the how it's divided us all, and actually how, all faiths used to coexist in India and be absolutely all right. Obviously there was problems happening between villages and villages, but that happens everywhere. And it's just something that's happening all around the world, this classic divide and conquer, which seems to be working so well. But it just meant that there's, my ancestors have had to go through centuries of trauma because of it. So yeah, I am angry about partition and A Suitable Boy, not as much as I am about partition. But yeah,
oh, good.
Fine. Your next guest, Vikram Seth, next week.
I think you give me too much credit as to who I can get. Not that you're not a good guest. But Ian, I know we've given a bit of time to Gitika to talk about one of her plays she's proud of. I want to give you a bit of time to talk about your latest book, about the thought of, obviously, Neeraj Chaudhary. Can you tell maybe the viewers and the audience who may not be familiar with him a little bit about what got you interested in him? Someone who's an Anglophile, obviously, but obviously one of the most celebrated biographies that he wrote as well in the 20th century. Tell us a bit about him and your book.
I mean, I'm not going to plug my book, primarily not because of modesty, because I don't really make any money from it. So, I mean, I think just trying to tie it into perhaps some of the conversations we're having, because Niraj Chowdhury was a notorious Anglophile. He was an Indian Anglophile, and he wrote so like as a leftist, it was strange to write about him because his politics were very conservative, very pro-empire. He's a Bengali, what they call a Bengali Bhadralok, or one of the Bengali upper caste classes. But at the same time, he had a brilliant mind. He was a brilliant intellectual. And he wrote a book that Doris Lessing called possibly the greatest memoirs written in the English language, which is autobiography of an unknown Indian. And also Salman Rushdie, depending what you think of Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie also called it the one truly great book to emerge from the Indo-British encounter. And whatever you think about his politics, because I'm English and I'm offended by it, so I can't imagine what an Indian reader would feel about it. Yeah, but it's sort of a very sort of at times very negative, relentlessly negative depiction of India of Indian people. But at the same time, even his critics sort of acknowledge the extraordinary lyrical beauty and description of the way he describes his Bengali childhood, the way he paints 1930s Calcutta in exquisite detail, extraordinary detail, and the wealth of erudition the man had, the truly extraordinary range of his classical references. I'm not just talking about Vedic or Sanskritic or Puranic references. I'm talking about sort of Shakespeare as well. He had a truly global range of reading. So I guess this is what paradoxically drew him to me. And it was difficult to write about because it's always difficult to write about people you really sort of politically feel at odds with. And he was a very sort of grumpy right-wing contrarian. But here's where it maybe ties into some of the conversations we might have, because in many ways he comes across as the native informant, and negatively, some people have even called him, a self-colonized intellectual. So the way empire always recruits these so-called native intellectuals to legitimize their narratives, and of course we can all think of examples of that. But I found from my own political, anti-colonial, leftist perspective, I found it interesting to see how a man like that ticks, like to go from the inside and see how ideology really can capture a person. Yeah, it's not about ideology putting a gun to your head and telling you to say something, but it's when you spontaneously produce this yourself. No one's forcing you. You spontaneously saying how much you love Wordsworth and the Queen and how much the British have done. And this is coming through. So I found it sort of fascinating. Because he was no fool. This was not a case of a stupid man who was duped. He could run rings around any Oxford academic. This man was a great intellectual, but a bit like the V.S. Nepal, and sadly a little bit like Salman Rushdie, he reproduced these very imperialist Western narratives. And that the complexity of that is what drew me to him.
I just wanted to change tact a little and the focus. It's just about, I guess, coming back to the appreciation of South Asians. The NHS is very much prominent as due to the issue with coronavirus. I don't know what your thoughts are, but if you look at the 60s and 70s in terms of the immigration of South Asian doctors, even parts of South Wales, where people perhaps may not want to go and work, or there may be numerous reasons, but they account for more than 70% of the general practitioners in that area. So there's clearly a sense of responsibility, a sense of dedication that you see from people of South Asian heritage who contribute to institutions that every country should have, such as the NHS. I don't know what your thoughts are about things like that. I'll leave that to either of you. Gitika?
Yeah, I don't know if I can comment, apart from I can just agree with you. They do play a massive part and do play a massive role in the NHS, and I think sometimes that goes a bit unnoticed. Don't know why, but I think that it does.
No, absolutely. I mean, like, you have this tremendous structure of the National Health Service, right? And in the wake of the building of the modern welfare state. And yeah, I mean, obviously, for South Asian doctors, it's a tremendous contribution that South Asian doctors continue to make to this structure, which we don't really fully appreciate until, for example, I lived in the US 5 years, and I really haven't much. The first time I was sick in the US, all I got in the hospital was bills. The first thing they talked about was credit cards, and the horror stories, which are cliche, and you've heard probably from anyone who's lived and had to work with the American healthcare system. But this is why we shouldn't normalize or take for granted the fact of the NHS. And I mean, we have a government which I would say this is off the top of my head, but every third Conservative MP. I would say also, sadly, some Labour and some Lib Dem MPs, but definitely every, sits on the board of directors of a pharmaceutical, of a healthcare company, and all of these private companies are slowly making inroads into the NHS in a very, very quiet way. And the degree of, we can call it corruption. It's not privatization. It's hijacking public services and selling them out to personal friends, or in the case of the minister who was on BBC Radio 4 this morning, the man who 6 years earlier was working for Serco, now as minister decides that Serco is the best company to administer this test and trace. I mean, and there's so many rackets like this to be found. Although to their credit, BBC Radio 4, Nick Robinson did point this out. We do seem to have in the UK a media which is largely complacent about the levels of corruption. So to get back to the South Asian point, I'm really worried that diversity is not used as a smokescreen to normalize other things. Like, diversity is really important, but we should be very, and it's really even getting back to we shouldn't automatically assume that just because we have a Priti Patel or a Rishi Sunak or a Sajid Javid, that it's necessarily a good thing in itself. We have to be listening very carefully and watching very carefully what they're doing and saying, because governments like the UK, increasingly are not stupid. They are adopting these multicultural appearances, but to often usher in very, very sort of anti-immigrant or very sort of hostile policies. Does this make sense? I mean, am I connecting with some of the things that Gitika was saying here?
I think we've certainly chosen a very vast topic, and we probably need another hour to discuss it. But yeah, you've certainly touched a number of points, and some concerns exist. Lots of reassurances given. Time will tell which way we go. But I guess just to kind of summarize, because we are losing time quite quickly. we know the value of South Asian heritage. I know we haven't been able to talk about chicken tikka masala or the way music's been influenced, or the caste system or the institution of marriage, the pros and cons. There's lots of things that we can certainly talk about. But I guess we wanted to kind of end with perhaps yourself, Gitika, just around 3 areas that you think people should consider when they think about not just South Asian heritage, but heritage in general from different backgrounds.
3 things. I don't know. You've said loads of them already, so I'm going to pick some of them that you just said. So music, food, music, food, and dancing, like different dancing styles. I feel like that tells a lot about culture. Certainly mine, anyway.
Great. And what about yourself, Ian? Any kind of 3 reflections or 3 pointers for people listening?
I don't know about 3. Can I just respond very personally? I think
Sure.
the temple that I see from my house is a constant, really beautiful reminder. It's a beautiful structure. There's a mandir here in Broadgate. That's really, really sort of. I often think that it's such a beautiful building, and I think it says all that is best about the past and the present of South Asian heritage in this very simple structure.
Yeah. No, great. So, Fahim, I guess to wrap up, what do we have scheduled for next week?
Yeah, I think next week we've speak with pharmacy. So we've got pharmacists who are going to be talking about that with us, and we're really looking forward to having them. Both Colin Ferns, he's part of Delphi Medical and has a wealth of experience in terms of the pharmaceutical work line, in terms of addiction and so on, and he's been very active in medical education in that sense. And so that should be really quite an interesting evening. And also Atif Sadiq, who is also an academic pharmacist as well. So the pair of them should be hopefully spending some time with us. I know our producer has given some extra time to us. So just before we finish, I think it would be a bit remiss, Ian, if I didn't ask you a little bit about your experience of South Asians in Qatar, because we've not discussed that at all this evening. And obviously you've talked a bit about South Asia in Britain, obviously time in America, but do you think that's something Gitika could maybe write a theatre production on, or what the mileage and obviously this experience and what they do? Because it's quite an interesting thing. Obviously, many are from Bangladesh or India subcontinent, and in terms of how we all actually visit these countries in the Middle East and the Gulf, with or without degrees of apprehension, or perhaps thinking about the levels of the migrant workers, their labour. Sometimes we put it to the back of our head and enjoy, all the nice shiny malls, and then come back and think, well, they're earning more than they were in their country of origin. Is that the way to look at it, or should we have a much more nuanced view when we do visit these countries?
It sounds like a loaded question, right? I mean, we're going to definitely have a less nuanced view. Yeah, I think Gitika would do a wonderful day. She can definitely come to Qatar and see the situation there, but it is a complicated situation. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can sort of talk about it in such a small part of time, but you do have the Gulf is very physically close to the South Asian subcontinent, and historically, not just over the past 20 years with the petrochemical boom, but also earlier. There's a long history of South Asian culture coexisting in the Gulf, particularly in Oman. But the brute truth is that, yeah, I mean, there are sort of unpleasant realities about it. It is to some degree a parallel society. You do have a class of migrant laborers, which earn very little money, and I'm not going to gloss over that at all. It's awful. I think the only thing I would say is that it's like an explicit form of capitalism. Whereas what we have in the West are sort of subtle, veiled forms of capitalist exploitation. Like the person who will deliver your Amazon. These gig economy workers that are also, living on starvation wages, right? Just keeping this real here, yeah. But yeah, definitely in Qatar, there's a whole variety of perspectives there. I think you have a migrant labourer class. Many of them Keralans, people from Kerala, people from South India. Many of the taxi drivers are sort of Bangladeshi. They gravitate towards certain professions, and then you do have a professional class. You do have a professional class, which is also there is a South Asian, a strong middle class there as well. It's sensitive. I think the saddest thing is that if you look at YouTube videos of the 1950s and 60s in Qatar, you see Qataris sitting on the floor and laughing and joking with other Indians, okay? And you don't see that today. You do then. In the 1960s, 50s, if you look at you can go on YouTube and find them. You see them just chatting like they're just completely economic equals, just chatting, sharing cigarettes, everything. But that's not the situation today. But that isn't necessarily to do with culture. That's to do with economics. Yeah, I mean, you have in all of these, in the Emirates as well, you have this this is money that we're talking about, right? It's what happens when one demographic gets this super propelled jet of capital and becomes significantly wealthier than the other. You get these divisions in societies. But it is definitely a place that you have to visit before you talk about. You can't just go with the what's the film? Sex in Dubai, is it? Shopping in Dubai? Am I getting that wrong? Sorry. Anyway, you can't go with the kind of Hollywood sort of landscape. No Sex in the City, is it? Am I getting that right?
I don't Mission Impossible.
That's quite a broad range there, Ian. But no, I think
you've got to go and visit it yourself. But yeah, I think, I think the fascinating thing is that, and Arab listeners may not be happy when I say this, but if the Gulf could vote politically, it would belong to India, because the Indian population there is so huge. Saudi Arabia, as well as Qatar, as well as the UAE, and you go there and you're eating biryanis and you're listening to Indian music, and also Qataris are eating Indian food as well. So something very interesting is taking place, and I'm not glossing over the exploitation, but it is a space in which it is truly postmodern. Like, we're seeing in the future what kind of spaces are going to evolve. But I would say a little bit sadly that it is a little bit of a segregated space as well. The white expats have their cultural spaces, and the South Asian migrant labor community has its spaces, and the Qatari elite have their spaces, and there's not much crossover, but there is some. But yeah, sorry, I don't want to take over. I mean, that's more or less everything I can say within a lot of time.
That's at the end of our time, isn't it, Mehran?
Yeah, pretty much. We're a bit over time.
Definitely come and do a play or make a film or something, definitely.
Excellent. Yeah. Good. Thank you very much to our guests, both Gitika and Ian, and obviously my co-host Mehran. It's been a pleasure having a broad range of topics to discuss. And for everyone listening and watching at home, please do look into the South Asian Heritage Month and do seek out your own experiences of South Asia if you're not familiar with it. Thank you so much. Good evening.
Take care.